So we've spoken about what is yoga in relation to the Sāṇkhya model of reality and the tattvas, these different constituents of reality, which we can call the tattvas, aspects of that which exists in manifest existence. We can also call them ganas, members of the group or constituent parts of the whole of existence. And we've mentioned how the tattva model of reality from the Sāṇkhya school of philosophy gives us a very practical frame of reference, a structure which we can use and refer to and work with to foster and invite yoga. If we want to invite togetherness, then we need to invite all of the constituent members of the group of our being to come together. And so the tattvas model of reality, the Sāṇkhya model of reality, with those tattvas is a very practical frame. And yoga assumes that we are familiar with that Sāṇkhya model of reality. So I've mentioned briefly the idea that in the traditional orthodox classical schools of Indian philosophy, which yoga is very much part of, there are sometimes referred to 6 classical schools or 6 orthodox schools of Indian philosophy. Yoga is very special in Indian philosophy because it is an intrinsic part of classical orthodox Indian philosophy, and it also is an intrinsic part of other schools that stand somewhat outside of the orthodox Vedic mainstream in the Indian Sanskrit tradition. We'll talk more about that later, but the main point to mention is that in the orthodox classical school of Vedic Indian philosophy and the arts and science of life, yoga is absolutely intrinsic to that worldview or to that system. But yoga does not exist by itself. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It grew and was developed in a very vibrant context of practical Indian philosophy. And yoga exists in relation to these other schools. We mentioned already there are schools that are all to do with how we decide if something is real or not. How can we decide if we can know something, if something is valid? So we have the schools of Tarka, Jñāna and Vaisheshika, which deal in logic, epistemology, and also the physical constituents of reality. And those two are a pair. Jñāna and Vaisheshika make up the Tarka schools. Sāṇkhya, Yoga are a pair. So there's no yoga without Sāṇkhya, there's no Sāṇkhya without yoga. Of course, there could be, but yoga is built on top of the Sāṇkhya view of reality. This model of the tattvas, yoga works with it. It takes it for granted. So when, for example, in the classic yoga texts like the Yoga Sutra from Patanjali or the Bhagavad Gita, many aspects of this Sāṇkhya model are referred to, sometimes not in an overt way, but it's understood, that frame of reference is understood. So it's really, really foundational, very helpful to be familiar with that basic Sāṇkhya model of the tattvas. Really, really helpful. So I would recommend, when you're practicing, think of the tattvas. In the next couple of weeks, get to know them inside out. Every day, think, today I'm going to work with the elements. Today I'm going to work with the tanmatra. Let me work with my indriyaha. Let me think of my antakarana. Practice them. This is an important thing. In the yogic system, practice and study are not separate things. One thing that's happened in recent years is that the Western Academy has started producing content, published content about yoga and about the Sanskrit tradition. And some of this content, to my mind, is horribly misleading, terribly misrepresentative, and I didn't realize how angry it makes some Indian scholars and practitioners. Because what's happening is that in the Western Academy, I have a friend who teaches in an Israeli university, and he says to me, he says, James, I cannot teach Sanskrit, I have to teach about Sanskrit. Because he's constrained by the Western academic system. The Indian system of learning never separates practical and theoretical learning. Yoga is inclusive. It's practical. So to study yoga means to practice. To practice yoga means to study. You cannot do one without the other. In the Indian system, practice and study, or theoretical knowledge and understanding, and practical, experiential, embodied understanding, are referred to as two wings of the same bird. Jnāna, the theoretical knowing, and vijñana, the experiential understanding. Two wings of the same bird. If we take off one of those wings, can the bird fly? No. The bird can think it's travelling a long way because it's making such an effort to flap around and spiral along the ground. And it can get some distance, for sure. But how is that distance compared to that which could be covered if the bird spread its two wings and soared? So the idea in yoga practice is we cannot separate yoga practice from study, because the basis of yoga practice is inquiry, is paying attention, paying close attention, inquiring. How does this affect my balance? How does this affect my experience of integration and wholeness? So there's no separation between practice and study in the Indian system. And this is very important to be aware of. So the idea is these structures can help empower our practice. They can help earth. We talked about this earlier, the importance of earthing, rooting, grounding our practice. The supports of the structures and frames that the theoretical system or the philosophical frame gives us help make our practice that much more robust, that much more efficient. They help guard against the complacency that can come when we slip into the valley of false enlightenment, when we manage to, for example, somebody can perhaps experience some great progress in a yoga technique and think, oh, now I'm good at yoga. Big mistake. Becoming adept at a yoga technique is no indication of becoming adept at yoga. We know becoming adept at yoga when we can be steady, come what may. The ability to stand on one finger with one foot wrapped behind one's head is not necessarily an indication of that. The process of learning to do such a thing can teach a person a lot about him or herself. And so it can be a very useful process. But it seems quite evident that there is no great percentage of enlightened masters amongst the contortionist community. Certainly no higher percentage than any other subculture or demographic of general society. Any discipline can be a method of yoga practice if it recruits all parts of ourself, all the gunas, all the tattvas, all the members of the gang of our being into the present moment. So we have to be very careful not to get carried away with yoga techniques. Similarly with meditation, sometimes people learn, just like with asana, there are what I call the glamour poses. You can see it all over Instagram and in yoga magazines, which you can probably tell by the tone of my voice I don't have a great deal of respect for or esteem for. But the glamour shots, and it just pains me because I see people and they're obviously in a disintegrated state. They're obviously in a state, the posture that they're taking for the camera is not fostering harmony in the body. It might be, for example, tearing their pelvis in two, destabilizing the structure. It doesn't look steady and easeful as a yogasana is classically defined in the Yoga Sutra, for example. Similarly, in meditation, there are glamour practices. Flying in the sky, for example, levitating off the ground, impressions, seeing things at a distance, all these superpowers. Now, some people can develop these. If you practice them, it's like anything. Things, and as the practitioner moves from gross to subtle, we can develop these subtler capacities. And so it can be a trap that a person could fall into, is to think that when they develop some capacity in some technique that was previously beyond them, they think that, oh, now I've got it. No. In the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali is very, very clear about this. When these powers come, do not be distracted by them. If, for example, you are there meditating in your meditation chamber, there you are, minding your own business, but then all of a sudden, this bevy of celestial beings, these glorious angels, come and say, hello there, we've been waiting for you. What are you waiting there for? Tonight in the heavens there is let's say, for example, you are a fan of dancing, and let's say you like coconut water, like I do. So, for example, they've come, just for example's sake, this hasn't happened, but for example, they come to me, this bevy of glorious, gorgeous, celestial angels, say, hey there, James, what are you doing sitting in your bedroom all alone? Come with us tonight in the heavens. The celestial orchestra are playing, and the celestial dancers have lit up the dance floor, and they're waiting for you to dance with them, and you like that coconut water straight from the tree. Wait till you try the celestial coconut water. What do we need to do in that instance? It would be easy to think, oh, great, I've made it. The practice has worked. No. The theory tells us, the theoretical understanding prepares us for this potentially derailing, disturbing eventuality. And reminds that when that happens, what we have to do is say, well, thank you very kindly for the invitation, but I'm busy right now. And then we return our awareness back to the center. Similarly, a friend of mine, many years ago, studying the Yoga Sutra with a group in Mysore, South India, and one of the students, he's a very, very sharp, intelligent person. He worked for Google at that time. I think he's become a full-time yoga teacher now, but very highly developed, cutting, analytical mind, and a very pragmatic man. He was of Teutonic heritage. I think he was Austrian. And in the class, we did the whole of the Yoga Sutra over several weeks and months. And one time he asked me, he says, James, what is it with all these superpowers that come in the 3rd chapter of the Yoga Sutra? You know, I'm not interested in that. I'm quite happy with my meditation and my pranayama and my asana practice. I'm not worried about flying in the sky and all that. Why does Patanjali need to talk about all these things? Now, in the 3rd chapter of the Yoga Sutra, when we'll talk about the Yoga Sutra in due course, more specifically about it, but in the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali mentions in the 3rd chapter these extraordinary powers that may be experienced by somebody practicing yoga. And encoded therein are techniques that are intended to help refine the practitioner's awareness. The idea being that when we refine our awareness, we bring to the surface the blocks that we are harboring inside that are getting in the way of us experiencing yoga in a more sustained way. So there are lots of reasons why these techniques and practices are there, but you don't have to do them. But there's also the possibility that you could be there one day in your meditation or in your practice and you experience things that you've never experienced before. So, for example, there you are meditating. So I said to this guy, I said, there you are meditating happily. What happens if you take off from the ground? This could freak you out. This could short circuit the circuit of your being. This could put you on some crazy ego trip. So Patanjali in the Yoga Sutra, when he lays all that out, the Yoga Sutra is the practice manual of enlightenment. This is how my teacher described it. He says, it's not the fairy tale of enlightenment, it's the practice manual. It's very thorough, it's very, it's been thoroughly tested, and it's a very thorough and comprehensive map for the journey of yoga practice. So for example, you're out in your newly bought car. Did you read the whole practice manual before you set off on the first test ride? Probably not. But maybe it's some fancy new car and you just can't for the life of you work out how to do some simple thing on the dashboard. You might look in the manual and it can give you some guidance. Similarly, you set off on your yoga journey, your journey of yoga practice, and you've got, you know more or less your orientation. You're going to work with this technique and why you're practicing. But then some things happen you hadn't been expecting. You might consult the manual. Now the idea in yoga is that we practice and we study at the same time. So we keep exploring practically and we keep deepening our awareness of the underlying the coexisting support structure of the yoga theory and the yogic method, which is encoded in many ways, in different texts, in the tradition, many mutually complementary ways. In, for example, the ultra-distilled sutra form, Patanjali Yoga Sutra, in the glorious verse of the dialogue, the conversation of the Bhagavad Gita, and in the epic story of the Ramayana, for example, and in the fantastical, mythical, archetypal stories of the Puranas. And as we keep engaging with these different lenses of these different texts, these different teachings, and we keep exploring practically in the context of our own life and practice, there's the idea that it all mutually supports each other, and the yoga that we experience becomes more and more robust, more firmly rooted, that much better able to withstand the winds of change that are part of life. We make ourselves more and more like a gnarly rose bush rather than a tender rose stem. Think of the rose, yeah? Such a beautiful flower. But how is it able to share its beauty and its fragrance with the world? First, it has to anneal itself. It has to grow from this tender shoot into this very resilient, robust, gnarly stem with the thorns on it. And then, the winds come, the winter frost and ice comes, hot summer days come, and the rose can live for a long, long time and share its beauty perennially in an ever-fresh way. So in order to anneal ourselves, there's the idea that practice and study are a continuous journey. It's like a continuous mutually supportive path. It's not that, so one thing that I've sometimes heard, and it just, it disturbs me when I've heard it. Like, it happened to me a few years ago. I was in the United States, and a friend of mine had invited me to come and give some teachings where he lives and works. And we were doing this weekly class on mythology. And there was going to be a weekend program looking at Patanjali Yoga Sutra. And one yoga teacher came to one of the satsang classes, and my friend said to her, next weekend we're doing a special immersive weekend on the Yoga Sutra. And this person said, I studied the Yoga Sutra on my teacher training. She said, I studied the Yoga Sutra in the past simple tense, as if glancing through some translation of the Yoga Sutra on a teacher training program is studying the Yoga Sutra. No. Completely missed the point. The Yoga Sutra is not a book that you read then pass on to your neighbor because you finish with it. It's not that type of book. You pass on the book once you've completely installed it into your cells, so you know it by heart. Not in a rote way, but you've put its teachings into the heart of every cell of your being. So you no longer need the book because the book is in you. And you've installed it with the auto-update feature. How do you do that installation job? You do it by studying and exploring the teachings for many, many years in a diligent, steady, appropriate, nourishing, ongoing way. Because yoga practice, as we've mentioned already, is a constant, unbroken, wholehearted, committed effort. And yoga practice equals yoga study. Yoga study equals yoga practice. So it's very important that when we're considering yoga to recognize this. This is one of the things that also yoga, I would say, assumes, that we are aware that this is a practical system. It's not armchair philosophy. So I mentioned earlier this idea. Sometimes now the Western Academy is writing about yoga and spreading a lot of, I would say, misrepresentative information. It is talking about something it doesn't really know about, because the assumptions of the Western Academy are not broad or practical or inclusive enough to take into account the very basics of the yogic method. It's like swimming, for example. One can observe swimming and maybe one can write about it and study it and become something of an expert about swimming. But if you've not been in the water, do you really know what swimming is? Personally, I'm not interested in hearing what somebody who's never been in the water has to say about swimming. Well, I'm not particularly interested in. I'd much rather hear what Laird Hamilton has to say about swimming. Laird Hamilton is an incredible waterman, big wave surfer. He has swum in all sorts of oceanic conditions. He knows what it means to swim. He's had to swim to save his friend's life more than once. He's had to swim to save his own life. He's swum in huge ocean swells. He knows what swimming is in a very, very deep way, because he's practiced it. He's thought about it. He's reflected on it. He's a student of the ocean. He's a student of the water who practices in it. So the main idea here that I really want to emphasize, yoga practice and yoga study are the same thing. Two wings of the same bird. One cannot have one without the other.